Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, sat on the damp bench outside a small cafe in the rain, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at his phone screen. He was used to the uncertainty, the way every day felt like a new battle he wasn't sure he would win. With his father's debts weighing heavily on his shoulders and his mother's illness draining every last penny, Mark was doing his best to keep his head above water. But it was hard. Harder than it had ever been. And just as he thought things couldn't get worse, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He answered, trying to sound calm. "Mark Davis," he said, his voice barely steady. A woman's voice on the other end responded, cool and composed, "This is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He frowned, confused. "Who are you? How do you know about my situation?" "I know enough," she replied, her tone unwavering. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. He was left with his thoughts racing. Who was this woman? How did she know about his debts? And why did she want to meet him? But what was the alternative? He had nothing to lose. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets as Mark walked through the city, his mind racing with unanswered questions. He arrived at the cafe, drenched and exhausted, but there she was. Eleanor Brooks sat at a corner table, her posture impeccable, her eyes sharp, and her presence commanding. She was in her mid-70s but held herself like someone much younger. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her tailored suit radiated wealth and power. Mark approached, feeling out of place in his soaked jacket and worn shoes. She looked up at him and gestured to the chair across from her. "Mr. Davis," she greeted him, her voice calm, as though they had met a dozen times before. "Sit down." Mark hesitated for a moment before taking the seat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he tried to mask it. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I know about your father's debts," Eleanor said, her eyes locking with his. "I know you're struggling to keep up with the bills and that your future is uncertain. I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark frowned, unsure of what to make of her words. "A solution?" he asked, his mind already racing. Was she offering him a loan? A job? His thoughts bounced from one possibility to another. She set her cup down on the table and leaned in slightly. "Marry me." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Marry me, Mr. Davis. Not for love, but for a business arrangement. I will pay off your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you will be my husband. A companion. Someone to help me protect my legacy." Mark stared at her, dumbfounded. "What?" he blurted, feeling like he had misunderstood her. But she was serious. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't joking. "Think of it as a contract," she continued, her voice steady. "I don't need love. I need someone to help me control my estate and keep up appearances. You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of help. You would be helping me as much as I'm helping you." Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. His mind raced. Was this really happening? Was he really considering it? Marrying a woman he barely knew, just to save himself and his family from financial ruin? But what choice did he have? "I'll think about it," Mark said finally, his voice low. He needed time to process, time to understand if this was the right thing to do. As he left the cafe that night, his mind was still spinning. Was he really going to marry Eleanor Brooks for money? Was he willing to sacrifice his pride, his dignity, for a chance to escape his crushing debts? He didn't know yet. But one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. And so, Mark's journey into the world of wealth, power, and complicated emotions had begun. The next day, Mark found himself sitting at a small, dimly lit cafe, waiting for Eleanor. His hands shook slightly as he tried to focus on the coffee in front of him. The weight of the previous night's conversation lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. Marry for money. It sounded insane. Yet, he couldn't help but think of the possibility it offered. The chance to free himself from the crushing burden of debt, the chance to secure his family's future. But there was something unsettling about it too, something about Eleanor, her cold efficiency, and the way she spoke, as if everything was a transaction. As he sat there, contemplating his next move, the door swung open, and Eleanor walked in. She looked as composed as ever, her presence commanding attention even in the casual setting of the cafe. She wore a tailored blazer, her silver hair immaculately styled, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to assess everything and everyone in the room in an instant. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her heels clicking softly on the floor with every step. "Mr. Davis," she said as she reached the table, offering him a polite smile. "I trust you had time to think about my proposal." Mark stood up as she sat down across from him, her movements graceful and deliberate. He nodded, but his mind was still swirling with doubt. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. "And I'm not sure I understand. Why me? Why choose me for this arrangement?" Eleanor's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained serious. "You're young, capable, and in need of help," she replied. "And I'm in need of someone I can trust to protect my legacy. I don't expect love. I don't need a romantic relationship. I need a companion, someone who can stand by me and help me manage what I've built. Someone who understands the importance of appearances, but also has the strength to make their own way in the world." Mark listened carefully, trying to understand her motives. Eleanor wasn't asking for love, just a practical arrangement. He had nothing to lose. His debts would be cleared, his future secure. But the idea of marrying someone he barely knew, someone so much older, felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. "What if I agree?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "What exactly would this involve?" "You said it's a business deal," but Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "We will live separate lives. You'll attend events with me, help me manage my estate when necessary, and in return, I'll provide you with the security you've been searching for, a home, a future without the weight of your father's debts hanging over you. It's an agreement, Mark. That's all." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and doubt. Mark thought of his mother, the medical bills that had been piling up, his sister's tuition that had yet to be paid. He thought of the life he could give them, the freedom from financial ruin. Eleanor's offer was tempting, but the question still lingered: could he really go through with it? "And what do you get out of this?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued. Eleanor's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of something Mark couldn't place. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. "I get peace of mind," she said quietly. "I've spent my life building an empire, Mark. I don't have family left, and I don't trust anyone to handle things the way I would. I need someone who can keep up appearances, who won't break under pressure." Her gaze softened again, though it was clear this was not a personal request, it was a business one. Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. A part of him still wanted to resist, but the practicality of the offer was undeniable. What did he have to lose? His family was barely holding on. And Eleanor, though intimidating, seemed to genuinely want to help. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice firm, though his heart was still heavy with uncertainty. "But I need to understand the details. What's the next step?" Eleanor nodded approvingly, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Good. We'll have to start immediately. There's a gala this weekend. You'll accompany me as my companion. We'll introduce you to the right people, and you'll begin to learn how to navigate this world. Mark felt a rush of nerves. The thought of being thrust into a world so different from his own was overwhelming. But he had made his choice. He was doing this for his family. He just hoped that, in the end, it wouldn't cost him more than he was willing to give. "I'll be ready," Mark said, the words leaving his mouth before he had time to think. Eleanor smiled again, a gesture that was both reassuring and unsettling. "Good. We begin tomorrow," she said, standing up and adjusting her blazer. "I'll see you then." As Mark watched her walk out of the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't reverse. He had agreed to marry Eleanor Brooks. He had agreed to a life he didn't understand, in a world that was nothing like the one he had known. And now, there was no going back. The next chapter of Mark's life was about to begin, but he couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right choice. Was he selling his soul for a future of security? Or was this the only way out? The next few days were a whirlwind for Mark. He barely had time to process the enormity of his decision before Eleanor pulled him into the world she had promised. The gala was only a few days away, and Mark was quickly thrust into a new reality. His wardrobe was upgraded, his mannerisms refined, and he was constantly reminded that this was no longer just about survival, it was about fitting into a world of wealth and appearances. The morning of the gala arrived. Mark stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his new suit. The fabric was smooth, the color dark and expensive. For a brief moment, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The boy who had walked through life unsure of his next step was gone, replaced by someone who felt strangely out of place in this new life. Eleanor arrived at his apartment later that afternoon, dressed to perfection, of course. She looked at him with a critical eye before giving him a slight nod of approval. "Not bad," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "But remember, it's not just the clothes. It's about how you carry yourself. Confidence is key." Mark nodded, his nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Eleanor's icy exterior remained, though he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her than she let on. She was offering him the world, yet he knew it came with strings attached. Still, he had no choice. His family needed him to succeed in this arrangement. He needed to succeed. The gala itself was everything Mark had imagined and more. It was held in one of the city's most luxurious hotels, its grand ballroom filled with wealthy socialites, business moguls, and powerful figures from all over the world. Mark could feel the eyes on him as he entered with Eleanor by his side. He was the outsider in this glittering crowd, but Eleanor guided him through it like a pro, introducing him to one influential person after another. "This is Victor Monroe, the head of the city's largest construction firm," Eleanor said, gesturing toward a tall man in a sharp tuxedo. Mark shook his hand, trying his best to mask his discomfort. He had never been in a room so full of people who seemed to live in an entirely different world. "A pleasure," Mark said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I've heard a lot about your work." Victor smiled politely, though there was something in his eyes that made Mark feel small, insignificant. "I'm sure you have," he replied coolly, before moving on to greet someone else. Mark felt Eleanor's hand on his arm, guiding him forward. "Don't worry about him," she said, her voice low. "You'll get used to this. It's all about the right connections." As the night wore on, Mark found himself growing more comfortable, at least on the surface. He nodded along to conversations, laughed at jokes he didn't fully understand, and tried to keep his nerves in check. But despite the polished facade, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a lie. Eleanor had promised him a life of security, but he wasn't sure what that life was supposed to look like anymore. Every handshake, every smile felt like it came with a price. Just as the night seemed to be winding down, a man approached them. He was tall, with sharp features and a confident smile. Mark couldn't help but notice how effortlessly this man commanded the attention of the room. Eleanor seemed to recognize him instantly, her face softening just slightly. "Liam Parker," she said, her voice almost warm. "I've heard a lot about you." The man, Liam, turned to Mark with a curious look. Mark Davis, he said, shaking Mark's hand firmly. You're new here, aren't you? His smile was genuine, but there was something calculating in his eyes. Mark felt a wave of unease. There was something about Liam Parker that made him uncomfortable, a sense that this man could see through him, could see exactly what he was, an outsider playing a part in a world that didn't belong to him. Yes, just starting to get my feet wet, Mark said, trying to sound casual. He could feel the weight of Liam's gaze, but he refused to let it show. Liam raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what to make of this arrangement, he said, his tone lighter than expected. But I can see why Eleanor likes you. You're doing well. Mark wasn't sure how to respond. Was that a compliment or a warning? He glanced at Eleanor, but she had already turned to speak with someone else, leaving him alone with Liam. I appreciate that, Mark said, his voice tight. I'm just doing what's needed. Liam studied him for a moment longer, his eyes flicking from Mark to Eleanor and back again. Well, it's an interesting arrangement, Liam said cryptically, before excusing himself and disappearing into the crowd. Mark watched him go, feeling unsettled. He didn't know what to make of Liam Parker, but he had a feeling he'd be seeing a lot more of him in the future. And that thought made him uneasy. As the night came to a close, Eleanor led Mark out of the ballroom, her expression unreadable. You did well, she said quietly, though Mark could sense there was more she wasn't saying. This is just the beginning, Mark. You'll have to learn how to handle the pressure. There's more at stake than just your family's future. It's about our future, too. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. The world he had entered was full of promises, but also full of dangers. Eleanor's world was not his, and he had a feeling it was a world that wouldn't let him walk away easily. As they stepped into the car, Mark stared out the window, his thoughts racing. Was he in over his head? And more importantly, would this arrangement change him in ways he wasn't ready for? The days following the gala were a blur for Mark. Eleanor was persistent in her teachings, guiding him through the nuances of high society with precision. Every conversation, every event was an opportunity for him to learn, to fit into this world that had once seemed so distant. Yet, despite his growing confidence in public, something inside him remained uneasy. The more he played the part, the more he began to feel disconnected from the person he used to be. One afternoon, Eleanor called him to her office. Mark had grown accustomed to these meetings, which always seemed to revolve around strategizing their next public appearance, but today felt different. Eleanor was more serious than usual, her face set in a hard line as she motioned for him to sit down. Mark, we need to talk, she said, her voice uncharacteristically cold. Things are moving faster than I expected. The board has started asking questions about our arrangement. Mark stiffened, unsure of where this conversation was going. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. Eleanor leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. There are people who think our marriage isn't just a business deal. They think we're actually in love. I'm not sure how that happened, but the rumors are starting to spread. We need to be careful, Mark. If we don't keep control of this narrative, it could get out of hand. Mark felt a pang in his chest. The thought of the world thinking they were actually in love sent a strange rush of emotions through him. Was that what Eleanor really wanted, though? He had thought this was just a transaction, an agreement between two people who could separate business from emotion. But now he wasn't so sure. I thought that's what we agreed on, Mark said slowly, trying to mask his confusion. That this was just a contract, not a real marriage. Eleanor nodded. It was, and it still is. But perception is everything. We have to maintain appearances, even if it means pretending. Her gaze softened for a brief moment, almost as if she were letting her guard down for a second. I've worked my whole life to build this empire, Mark. I'm not about to let it fall apart because of some misunderstanding. Mark nodded, but inside, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. He had agreed to this arrangement for security, to protect his family, but the more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he began to question his role in her life and in this world. Was he just a pawn in her game, or was there something more to it? So, what do we do now? Mark asked, trying to focus on the task at hand. We continue as planned, Eleanor said, her voice firm once again. We keep the facade up, go to the events, make the right connections. We stick to the story we've created, and we'll come out on top. You understand? Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing anymore. But at the same time, he couldn't afford to back out. His family depended on this arrangement, and he had already come too far. I understand, Mark said finally, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted. Eleanor's world was full of high stakes and constant vigilance. Mark was expected to be by her side at every event, every meeting. He was becoming more adept at handling the public side of things, but privately, he was struggling. The lines between the fake marriage and the real feelings he was beginning to develop were blurring. He caught himself thinking about Eleanor in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself wondering about her past, about her true feelings, and whether or not this was more than just a business deal to her. One evening, Eleanor invited him to dinner at her penthouse, a lavish apartment that overlooked the city's skyline. It was one of those rare moments when they weren't surrounded by the prying eyes of the public. Mark was still adjusting to the idea of being alone with her in a more personal setting. As they sat down to eat, Eleanor's usual icy demeanor softened just a touch. You've done well, she said, her tone softer than he had ever heard it. You're learning how to handle this world better than I expected. Mark looked at her, surprised by the compliment. Thanks, he replied, his voice quieter than usual. It's not easy, though. Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. No, it's not. But you're doing fine. Just remember, this is all temporary. We're in this for the long haul, for the bigger picture. Everything else is just noise. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. What exactly did she mean by temporary? Was she just referring to the business arrangement, or was there something more she wasn't saying? Before he could ask, Eleanor stood up, her posture once again commanding. I'll let you get some rest. We have another gala to attend tomorrow, and I want you at your best. Mark stood as well, following her to the door. All right, he said, though he wasn't sure if he could handle another night in this world of pretense. As he left her penthouse that evening, Mark felt a strange sense of loss. He had thought this arrangement would be simple, just a way to fix his problems. But now, he wasn't so sure. Eleanor had been his lifeline, but he was beginning to realize that this deal might come with a cost he hadn't anticipated. With every passing day, Mark was falling deeper into a world he didn't fully understand, and a marriage he wasn't sure he could keep pretending wasn't real. The days after the gala passed in a haze of events and constant media attention. Mark was growing more accustomed to his new life, but the weight of his role, Eleanor's husband, though in name only, was beginning to feel heavier. He couldn't ignore the way his feelings for her were starting to shift, nor could he deny that his once clear-cut reasons for agreeing to the arrangement were becoming muddled. The more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he realized how little he actually knew about her. Despite their public appearances, their private moments were few and far between, leaving him to wonder what lay beneath her calculated exterior. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Eleanor invited Mark to her penthouse again. It had become a routine by now, a quiet dinner for two where they could escape the public eye. Mark had started to look forward to these rare moments alone with her, but tonight, he felt a strange sense of tension in the air. As they sat down to eat, the silence between them was more pronounced than usual. Eleanor was focused on her food, not meeting his eyes. Mark cleared his throat. Eleanor, we need to talk. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. He could feel the weight of everything he had been bottling up. This arrangement. It's not what I expected. Eleanor looked up, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Mark wasn't sure if she had heard him, but then she put her fork down and leaned back in her chair. What do you mean? She asked softly, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. Mark hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, but the uncertainty had been building inside him for too long. I thought this was just a business deal. I thought we both knew what we were getting into. But the more time I spend with you, the more I feel like he stopped, searching for the right words. I don't know. It's just getting complicated. Eleanor sighed and stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the city. The lights of the skyscrapers glittered in the distance, but Mark could see the tension in her shoulders. She seemed like she was gathering her thoughts before she finally turned to face him. I never asked you to love me, Mark, Eleanor said quietly, her voice holding an edge of frustration. This was always meant to be a partnership. I don't need love. I need someone I can rely on, someone who understands the stakes of this life. It's not easy for me either. Mark stood up, his emotions starting to surface. But it feels like you're asking me to pretend. To keep up this facade. And I'm not sure if I can keep doing it. I thought I could handle it. But he stopped, his voice trailing off. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes cold, but there was a flicker of something softer in them. I never promised you anything more than security, Mark. I never promised you love. But I'm not the one who's confused here. You knew what this was from the beginning. Mark could feel his chest tightening. He had agreed to the arrangement for one reason: to protect his family, to secure their future. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself in the process. He was falling for her, and that was the one thing he couldn't afford. This wasn't a love story. It was a business deal. And yet, the more he was around Eleanor, the more his heart ached for something more. I didn't expect to fall for you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would happen. But it is. And I don't know what to do with that. Eleanor's face softened for just a moment, and Mark saw a side of her he hadn't noticed before. The woman who had spent her life building an empire, protecting herself from the world, now seemed more vulnerable than ever. You don't have to do anything with it, Eleanor replied quietly. You're here because you made a choice. You chose to be part of this. And now you're part of my world. It's complicated, but it's real. Mark's mind was spinning. She had made it clear from the beginning that this was never supposed to be about emotions. But everything was changing. Was he really just a part of her plan, a tool for her to control her empire, or had something shifted between them? He looked at her, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. So, what now? He asked, his voice filled with the weight of the question. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the desk, her back to him as she looked out the window again. The city lights cast shadows across her face, and for a moment, Mark saw a glimpse of something: fear, vulnerability, perhaps even longing. Finally, she turned to face him. Now we move forward, she said, her voice steady but soft. We continue with what we started. But we do it on our terms. We can't let the world dictate what happens between us, Mark. Not now. Not ever. Mark wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning, but it made something inside him stir. He wasn't sure if he could keep playing the role of the perfect husband any longer. But for the first time, he was starting to wonder if there was more to this arrangement than he had originally believed. Maybe they were both playing a game they didn't fully understand. As the night wore on, Mark felt the weight of his decision more heavily than ever. This partnership, this arrangement, was no longer just a way to escape his past. It was becoming something else entirely. And that terrified him. Tomorrow, another gala. Another event. Another opportunity for Mark to prove himself in a world that had no room for mistakes. But inside, he couldn't help but wonder, was he still in control of his own life, or was he losing himself to the very thing he had agreed to? The days following their conversation felt strangely heavy. Mark tried his best to focus on his role in Eleanor's world, but it was becoming harder to separate his emotions from the reality of their arrangement. Every event, every meeting, every social gathering felt like a performance. The facade they had built together was starting to crack, and the more he saw Eleanor in her element, the more he realized how deeply involved he had become in her life. Eleanor had been was part of her world now. But what was that world really like? Was he just a pawn in her game? Or was there something more to this arrangement that neither of them had fully understood? As the weeks passed, the tension between them grew. Eleanor remained as distant and focused as ever, but Mark couldn't help but notice the small cracks in her armor. There were moments when she looked at him differently longer than necessary, with a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. It was as if she was questioning him, or perhaps questioning herself. But she never spoke about it. And Mark, unsure of how to approach the situation, kept his distance as well. It seemed easier that way, easier to just pretend that nothing had changed. One evening, Eleanor invited Mark to a private dinner at one of her favorite restaurants. This wasn't a business dinner, nor was it a public event. It was just the two of them. Mark had become accustomed to these quieter moments, but tonight felt different. The air between them was charged with unspoken words, as if the entire evening was leading to something that neither of them was prepared for. They sat across from each other, the soft lighting of the restaurant casting shadows over their faces. Eleanor looked as elegant as always, her posture perfect, her expression guarded. Mark, on the other hand, felt a little out of place in the formal setting. It was hard to believe that he, a law student barely scraping by a few months ago, was now sitting across from one of the most powerful women in the city. After the waiter took their orders, Eleanor spoke first. "Mark, I've been thinking," she said, her voice unusually soft. Mark looked up, surprised at the change in her tone. "About the arrangement. About us." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure how to respond. What did she mean by "about us"? They had always kept their personal lives separate from their business agreement. At least, that's what he thought. But now, the line between the two seemed to be blurring. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Eleanor paused, taking a slow sip of her wine. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, weighing something in her mind. "I know you've been struggling with this," she said, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a while. "I've seen it. I know it's not easy, Mark. This arrangement wasn't supposed to be about emotions. But maybe it's becoming something more than that. For both of us." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. His worst fear was becoming reality. He had been trying to ignore the feelings that had been growing inside him, but hearing Eleanor say the words out loud made everything feel so much more real. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could continue pretending. "I don't know what to say," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected any of this. I thought it was just a way out. Just a way to help my family." But now, he trailed off, unsure of what to say next. Was he falling for her? Or was this just the consequence of being so close to her for so long? Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "You're not the only one who's struggling with this, Mark," she said softly. "I've spent my entire life building this empire, protecting it. I never thought I would need anyone. But then you came into my life. And now, I'm not so sure anymore. I don't know where this is going, but I know that I don't want to lose you. Not now." Mark's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Eleanor, the woman who had always seemed so composed, so in control, was admitting something he had never expected. She was scared too. She was vulnerable. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mark didn't know what to say, but he could feel the shift in the air, the way their connection had changed in an instant. "So what does that mean for us?" he asked finally, his voice shaky with emotion. "What happens now?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes softening as she reached across the table to take his hand. "It means that we have to figure this out together," she said, her voice filled with a sense of determination. "We don't have all the answers, but I think we can make this work. If we want to." Mark looked at her, his heart beating faster now. The uncertainty that had plagued him for so long was still there, but now, it didn't feel so overwhelming. For the first time, he felt like they were in this together. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was willing to find out. As the night continued, Mark and Eleanor talked, not about business or appearances, but about their fears, their hopes, and the future. It was a conversation that felt long overdue, one that neither of them had dared to have until now. And though the road ahead was still unclear, Mark felt something shift inside him. Maybe this wasn't just a business deal after all. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. When they left the restaurant, the city lights twinkling around them, Mark realized that for the first time in weeks, he wasn't pretending anymore. Neither of them was. The days that followed their dinner were filled with an uneasy peace. Mark and Eleanor had opened a door that neither of them could close again. Their relationship, once built on an agreement, had become something more, something neither of them fully understood. Mark still wrestled with his emotions, but the connection between them had shifted. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was starting to care. And the idea that Eleanor might feel the same way made everything more complicated. Mark had thought he could navigate this arrangement with a clear mind, always staying focused on the practical side of things. But now, as they continued to attend events and meetings, he felt himself becoming more deeply entrenched in Eleanor's world. She was still distant at times, as she always had been, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments when she let her guard down, and he saw the woman behind the empire. That woman, he was learning, was vulnerable too. She wasn't just the powerful CEO he had first met, she was someone who had spent years guarding herself from the world, someone who had never allowed herself to depend on anyone. One afternoon, as they sat in Eleanor's office, she looked at him with a rare softness in her eyes. Mark had come to her with questions about the future of their arrangement, about the direction they were heading. But instead of offering solutions or business strategies, Eleanor simply said, "I never thought I'd be in this position, Mark. I've spent my life building everything I have, and for the first time, I'm scared. Not of losing what I've built, but of losing you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected to hear those words from her. Eleanor, the woman who had always seemed so sure of herself, was admitting that she was afraid of something that wasn't a business deal or a merger, but something deeper. "Eleanor," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper, "I never thought I'd be in this position either. I came into this for my family, for security. But somewhere along the way, I found myself wanting more. I'm not sure if I'm ready to face what that means, but I can't ignore it anymore." Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the city skyline. The view was stunning, but Mark couldn't focus on the lights, his attention was solely on her. "I don't want this to just be a deal anymore," she said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "I never wanted that. But I've spent my whole life keeping people at arm's length. I've never let anyone in, Mark. Not really. But with you. I feel like maybe it's time to change that." Mark stood, taking a few steps toward her. He could feel the weight of her words, the vulnerability she was offering him. It felt like a choice, a turning point in their relationship. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time, he didn't want to walk away from it. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I don't know what this is yet, but I want to figure it out with you. I'm not ready to lose you either." For a moment, neither of them said anything. They stood there, the city lights flickering in the background, the tension between them palpable. Mark felt like they were standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain, but also something real. Finally, Eleanor turned to face him. "Then we take it one step at a time," she said, her voice steady. "We don't have all the answers, but we have each other. And for now, that's enough." Mark nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. They were no longer just playing a part. They were in this together, for better or worse. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something that neither of them had expected. As the night settled in, they both knew that their journey was far from over. But they were no longer pretending. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The following weeks brought a change that neither Mark nor Eleanor could deny. Their partnership had transformed into something much deeper, something that could no longer be defined by contracts or business terms. The once transactional relationship now carried warmth, small gestures of care, and quiet moments that spoke louder than words. For the first time since his father's death, Mark felt like he belonged somewhere. He was no longer just surviving, he was living. But just when things started to feel real, the world around them began to notice. The whispers that had once been background noise grew louder. People began to question their marriage again, this time not because they thought it was fake, but because it seemed too real. And that was a threat to some. One morning, Eleanor received a call that left her pale and silent. Mark watched her hang up the phone, her expression darkening in a way he had never seen before. "What happened?" he asked, his concern evident. Eleanor turned to him slowly, her voice sharp but shaken. "Someone leaked information about our marriage. They're saying it was a scam, that you married me for money, and that I used you to manipulate the board." Mark felt his stomach drop. The story had gone public. Their entire arrangement, their secret, was now front-page news. The hours that followed were chaos. Reporters crowded outside Eleanor's company, questions flying about her integrity and his motives. It was everything she had spent her life protecting herself from. The woman who had built her empire on precision and control was now watching it crumble under the weight of speculation. Mark stood by her side through every confrontation, every meeting, every glare from the people who had once respected her. But he could see the toll it was taking on her. She barely slept, her once sharp confidence replaced by exhaustion and fear. "Maybe I should walk away," Mark said one night, his voice low. "If I leave, they'll stop attacking you. You can tell them the truth, that it was all just business." Eleanor turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. "No," she said firmly. "You are not leaving. That would only prove them right. We did not come this far just to run away when things get hard." She stepped closer, her voice trembling now. "Mark, I spent most of my life alone. When I found you, I found something worth fighting for. I am not losing that because people cannot understand what we are." Mark felt a rush of emotion he couldn't hold back. He had always admired her strength, but seeing her vulnerable, fighting not for her company but for him, changed everything. "Then we fight," he said, his voice steady. "Together." He reached for her hand, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She held on tightly, her fingers interlocking with his as if anchoring herself to something real. Over the next few days, Eleanor and Mark faced the storm head-on. They made public appearances together, speaking calmly, showing unity in the face of scandal. What had started as damage control slowly became something genuine. People began to see them differently, not as a fabricated marriage, but as a couple standing strong despite the odds. The cameras might have captured their every move, but behind those images were two people who had found something worth holding on to. Late one evening, after another exhausting day of meetings and interviews, Eleanor stood with Mark on the balcony of her penthouse. The city lights shimmered below them, but she was not looking at the skyline. She was looking at him. "I used to think love was a weakness," she said softly. "Something that distracted people from what really mattered. But now I see that it is the only thing that makes any of this mean anything." Mark smiled, the tension of the past few weeks finally beginning to fade. "Then maybe we were never pretending," he said quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes glistening under the city lights. "No, we were not." And for the first time since their story began, there were no contracts, no conditions, and no pretenses left between them, only truth, and the quiet realization that what had started as an arrangement had become something real, something worth risking everything for. As the weeks passed, Eleanor and Mark's bond grew stronger, more real with each passing day. The world outside their bubble continued to speculate, but inside, they had created something no one could touch, something genuine, built on trust and mutual respect. Eleanor's empire, once fragile in the face of scandal, now stood firmer than ever. The press had shifted their focus, no longer questioning their marriage but admiring the resilience they had shown in the face of adversity. Mark, too, had changed. He was no longer the unsure law student struggling to find his place in a world that seemed beyond his reach. He had found his purpose, standing beside Eleanor not just as a husband, but as a partner, someone who had earned his place in her life. He had become a vital part of her world, not because of his name or status, but because of the connection they had built. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of Eleanor's penthouse, the tension of the past months finally seemed to dissipate. The world outside had quieted down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a moment of peace. Eleanor turned to Mark, her gaze soft and steady. "You were right," she said, her voice calm. "This wasn't just a business deal. We built something real. Something I never expected, but I'm glad we did." Mark looked at her, the warmth in his chest growing. "I didn't expect it either," he admitted, his voice slow. "But I'm glad we got here." Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the doubt, all the fear they had faced together, faded away. Eleanor reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "We've been through so much," she said softly, "and we're still standing." Mark smiled, squeezing her hand in return. "And we will keep standing. No matter what comes next." As they sat there, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Mark realized something profound. He had come into this arrangement thinking it was a way out, a temporary fix to a life that felt uncertain. But what he had found was a life he never knew he needed, one built on love, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Eleanor had changed his life in ways he never imagined, and in return, he had given her something just as valuable, his heart, fully and completely. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate the complex world they had found themselves in, but now they did it as equals. The press, the critics, the doubters, they no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had each other. And together, they were unstoppable. One quiet evening, Mark stood beside Eleanor as she looked out over the city from their balcony. "I never thought I would find love in a place like this," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "But here I am." Eleanor turned to him, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Neither did I," she replied. "But sometimes life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Mark smiled back, his heart full. "Yeah. It really does." And as they stood there, hand in hand, Mark knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Their love had started as an unlikely arrangement, but it had grown into something real. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. The end.